A young Nigerian boy kneels in the mud, shoulders trembling, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet pain. His lips pressed together, trying to stay strong, but his eyes betray him. Full of tears he's been holding in for too long. His stomach is empty, his clothes are torn, his dreams feel too heavy for his small body to carry. Behind him, a crowd of villagers stands still, not because they don't care, but because they've felt this same pain for years. A mother wipes her tears quickly so her child won't see. An old man looks away, ashamed he cannot help. A young girl clutches her wrapper tightly, scared this is her future too. And then the boy whispers, barely audible, "Does anyone even see us?" Silence, far away. A billionaire signs papers in a glass office, completely unaware that a single voice is about to shake everything he built.
Before you continue, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this powerful story.
The city of Golden Heights glittered like a crown under the evening sun. Tall glass towers reflected the sky, luxury cars whispered across smooth roads, and inside the most expensive penthouse in the tallest building stood Edward Lawson, one of the richest men in the country. Edward's life looked perfect. A billion-dollar empire, private jets, politicians calling him partner. He stood beside a wall of glass, overlooking the city, slowly sipping expensive wine. Far below, the streets sparkled with wealth. But far beyond those shining lights, hidden behind dusty hills and cracked roads, was a village called Riverside Hollow, and the people there lived in a completely different world. In Riverside Hollow there were no glass buildings, only rusted roofs, no luxury cars, only bicycles and worn-out sandals. And while Edward Lawson's company built towers of gold in the city, the villagers worked long hours on the very land his companies controlled. Under the burning sun, Daniel Carter wiped sweat from his forehead. Daniel was only 32, but life had already carved deep lines across his face. His hands were rough from years of labor, yet despite everything, his eyes carried a quiet determination. Beside him stood his daughter Emma, barely 8 years old, holding a small metal bowl. "Daddy," she whispered softly, "will we have rice tonight?" Daniel forced a smile. He knelt beside her, brushing dust from her hair. "We will eat tonight," he said gently. But inside, his heart ached, because he wasn't sure. A loud truck roared across the dirt road nearby. It carried the logo of Lawson Global Industries, the company that owned most of the land surrounding Riverside Hollow, the company that paid villagers barely enough to survive, the company that made Edward Lawson a billionaire. Daniel watched the truck disappear down the road, his jaw tightened. "Another shipment leaving," one of the older workers muttered. "They take everything from this land, and leave us nothing." No one argued, because everyone knew it was true. Back in Golden Heights, Edward Lawson stepped into a luxurious ballroom filled with powerful people. Crystal chandeliers glowed above them. Government officials laughed as servers carried silver trays of champagne. Tonight was a fundraising gala for the current administration, and Edward was the main sponsor. A politician approached him with a wide smile. "Edward, without your support, this government wouldn't stand." Edward chuckled confidently. "I simply support stability," he replied. But everyone in the room knew the truth. Edward funded the government, and the government protected Edward's empire. Meanwhile, in Riverside Hollow, night had fallen. Inside a tiny wooden house, Daniel sat at a small table with Emma. A single candle flickered between them. On the table sat a small bowl of plain cassava. No rice, no meat, just enough to quiet the hunger. Emma tried to smile as she ate, but Daniel noticed how slowly she chewed, trying to make the food last longer. His chest tightened. "Daddy?" she said softly. "Yes?" "Why are we poor?" The question struck him like a stone. Daniel looked at the candle flame for a long moment. Then he finally spoke. "Because the world is not always fair." Emma tilted her head. "But can it change?" Daniel stared into her hopeful eyes. For the first time in years, he wondered the same thing. At that very moment, miles away in Golden Heights, Edward Lawson stood on stage, raising a glass. The room fell silent. "To progress," he announced. to prosperity. The crowd erupted in applause, but far away, in a dark village with empty stomachs, Daniel Carter blew out the candle and whispered quietly into the night, "One day, something must change." Neither man knew it yet, but their lives were already moving toward the same storm, and when it arrived, it would shake the country. Morning arrived in Riverside Hollow long before the sun. The village woke not to alarm clocks, but to hunger. A thin mist hung over the dusty ground as roosters crowed and tired men stepped out of their small homes. Among them was Daniel Carter. He stood outside his wooden house pulling on his worn boots. His shirt was already faded from years of hard labor, the fabric thin from endless washing in river water. Behind him, the door creaked open. Little Emma stepped outside quietly. Her small eyes were still sleepy, but she forced a smile. "Good morning, Daddy." Daniel turned and knelt beside her. "Good morning, sunshine." She hugged him tightly. Her arms were small, but the weight of her hunger was heavy. "Will you come home early today?" she asked softly. Daniel paused. "I'll try." But deep inside, he knew he couldn't promise that. Miles away in Golden Heights, the sun rose over glass towers and luxury apartments. Inside one of those towers sat Edward Lawson. He was already dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, standing inside a private conference room overlooking the city skyline. Around the long polished table sat powerful government officials, ministers, advisors, men whose decisions shaped the entire country. Edward placed a document on the table. "This policy," he said calmly, "will allow development on unused rural land." One of the ministers adjusted his glasses. "You mean the farmland near Riverside Hollow?" Edward smiled slightly. "Exactly." Another official leaned forward. "But the villagers rely on that land." Edward shrugged. "They'll adapt." The room fell silent. Then slowly, one by one, the officials nodded. Because Edward Lawson didn't just bring ideas. He brought money. Back in Riverside Hollow, the workers were already in the fields. The sun climbed higher, burning the dry earth. Sweat rolled down Daniel's face as he swung his tool into the soil, again and again and again. Beside him, another worker groaned. "We work like animals," the man muttered, "but they pay us like beggars." Daniel didn't answer, but his jaw tightened, because he knew the man was right. By midday, the heat became unbearable. The workers gathered briefly under a small tree for shade. A truck from Lawson Global Industries arrived. The supervisor stepped out, clean uniform, polished boots, dark sunglasses. He carried a small envelope. "Today's payment," he announced. The villagers formed a line. One by one, they stepped forward. When Daniel reached the front, the supervisor dropped a few crumpled bills into his hand. Daniel stared at the money. His chest tightened. "That's less than last week." The supervisor shrugged. "New company policy." Daniel looked up slowly. "How are we supposed to survive on this?" The supervisor's expression hardened. "If you don't like it," he gestured toward the empty road, "you're free to leave." The villagers fell silent, because everyone knew the truth. There was nowhere else to go. That evening in Golden Heights, music echoed through the most expensive restaurant in the city. Edward Lawson sat at a long table surrounded by wealthy businessmen and politicians. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter filled the air. The table overflowed with expensive food, steak, seafood, imported wine. Edward raised his glass. "To progress," he said. "To growth." The room erupted in applause. None of them spoke about Riverside Hollow. None of them mentioned the workers sweating in the fields. To them, those people didn't exist. Back in the village, the sun disappeared behind the hills. Daniel walked slowly down the dusty road toward home. His body ached. His hands were blistered, but the small amount of money in his pocket hurt more than anything else. When he reached the house, Emma ran toward him. "Daddy!" He lifted her into his arms. But the smile on his face faded when he saw the empty cooking pot near the door. Emma noticed. "Did they pay you today?" Daniel nodded. She waited hopefully. "Can we buy rice tomorrow?" Daniel opened his hand. The small pile of money rested in his palm. Emma looked at it. Then she looked up at him. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just nodded slowly. "I understand." That hurt him more than any words could, because children shouldn't have to understand poverty. Later that night, Daniel sat outside under the stars. The village was quiet. Only the sound of distant crickets filled the air. He stared at the horizon where the faint glow of golden heights lit the sky. Two worlds, so close, yet impossibly far apart. Emma stepped outside and sat beside him. "Daddy," she whispered. "Yes?" "Why do the rich people have so much, while we have so little?" Daniel didn't answer immediately, because he had been asking himself that same question for years. Finally he spoke. "Because the system was built that way." Emma frowned slightly. "Can it change?" Daniel looked down at her small, hopeful face. And for the first time, a strange thought crossed his mind. Maybe it could. Maybe one day the poor would stop suffering in silence. Maybe one day they would stand up. Daniel looked again toward the distant city lights. His eyes hardened, because somewhere deep inside him, something had begun to wake, and once it fully awakened, nothing would ever be the same again. Morning in Riverside Hollow no longer felt like a new beginning. It felt like a continuation of the same struggle. The rising sun slowly climbed over the dusty hills, casting a pale orange glow across the village. Smoke curled from small cooking fires, and the sound of tired footsteps echoed along the dirt roads. Men and women stepped out of their homes carrying farming tools that had grown old with them. Among them was Daniel Carter. His body still ached from the previous day's work, but rest was a luxury he could not afford. Emma stood at the doorway of their tiny house, watching him quietly. "Daddy," she said softly. Daniel turned. She held out a small cloth. "I packed your lunch." Daniel opened it. Inside was a small piece of dry cassava. His heart sank. He forced a smile. "Thank you, Emma." But both of them knew the truth. It wasn't enough. The farmland stretched endlessly outside the village. Under the harsh sun, villagers worked like shadows, moving slowly across the dry earth. Daniel swung his tool into the soil again and again. Beside him, an elderly man struggled to stand upright. His name was Samuel Reed. Once he had been one of the strongest farmers in the village. Now his back was bent with age and years of labor. Samuel leaned on his tool and looked across the land. "You know," he said quietly, "this land used to belong to us." Daniel paused. "What do you mean?" Samuel sighed deeply. "Before Lawson Global arrived, our fathers owned these fields." Daniel frowned. Samuel continued. "They promised development, schools, hospitals, jobs." His eyes darkened, but those promises disappeared the moment they took the land. Daniel looked around at the workers sweating under the sun, the cracked soil, the tired faces, the empty hope. "Now we work on land that once fed our families." The words hit Daniel like a hammer. Later that afternoon, the heat became unbearable. The workers gathered briefly under a small tree for shade. Some wiped sweat from their foreheads. Others sat silently staring at the ground. One young worker finally spoke. "How long can we live like this?" No one answered, because everyone had asked that same question. Another man shook his head. "My children sleep hungry every night." A woman nearby wiped tears from her eyes. Daniel clenched his fists. The suffering in the village wasn't loud. There were no riots, no protests, just quiet pain, the kind that slowly crushed people from the inside. Meanwhile, far away in Golden Heights, Edward Lawson stood in his office overlooking the glowing city. A news report played on the television behind him. "Lawson Global Industries announces record profits this quarter." Edward smiled slightly. Another successful deal, another victory. His phone rang. A government minister spoke from the other end. The rural expansion plan is moving forward. Edward walked toward the window. Good, he replied calmly. Make sure there are no delays. From his view, the city looked perfect. Shining towers, busy streets, a symbol of progress. But Edward never looked far enough to see the villages beyond the hills, the places where his success had quietly planted suffering. Back in Riverside Hollow, evening finally arrived. Children slowly walked home from the small village school. Emma was among them. She carried an old notebook pressed tightly to her chest. Inside were drawings, tall buildings, wide roads, bright lights, the city she had never seen. She sat on a rock near the edge of the village and stared toward the distant hills. Beyond those hills, Golden Heights glowed faintly in the distance. Emma whispered softly to herself, "One day." But she didn't finish the sentence, because dreams were dangerous in places like Riverside Hollow. Night fell quietly over the village. Inside small homes, families gathered around tiny cooking pots. The food was never enough. Daniel sat beside Emma at the small wooden table. Their dinner was simple again, cassava and water. Emma tried to smile as she ate slowly. "Daddy," she asked gently. "Yes? Do you think life will always be this hard?" Daniel looked at her. Her eyes were still full of hope. He wanted to protect that hope, but lies were heavy things. So, he answered honestly, "I don't know." Emma nodded slowly. Then she said something that surprised him. "Maybe someone just needs to change it." Daniel froze. The words echoed in his mind. Maybe someone just needs to change it. Later that night, Daniel walked through the quiet village. Lanterns flickered in the darkness. Villagers sat outside their homes talking softly about their struggles. He saw tired faces everywhere, men who had given everything, women who had sacrificed everything, children who deserved more than this life. The suffering in Riverside Hollow had lasted too long, and for the first time, Daniel realized something important. The village had been silent for years, too silent, but silence was not the same as peace. Sometimes silence was simply the moment before a storm. Daniel looked up at the star-filled sky, and deep inside his heart, something began to change, because suffering could break a person, but sometimes it could also awaken them. And when people who have suffered long enough finally wake up, the world has no choice but to listen. The sun rose over Riverside Hollow, but this morning felt different. There was a whisper in the wind, a quiet energy that hadn't been here before. Daniel Carter walked through the dusty village path. His muscles ached from yesterday's labor, but his heart thumped with anticipation. Something was stirring, something big. At the center of the village, under the old baobab tree, a crowd was gathering. Their faces were a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and for the first time in years, hope. Standing on a small wooden crate was Marcus Bennett, a tall, commanding Nigerian African man in his late 40s. His presence alone demanded attention. He wore a neatly pressed traditional agbada, his leather sandals polished despite the dust. His eyes burned with determination, and his voice carried across the square like thunder. "Brothers, sisters," Marcus began, raising his hands. "For too long we have worked in silence. For too long they have taken from us and ignored us. Today we begin to change that." Some villagers whispered among themselves, skeptical. Could one man really make a difference? But others leaned forward, drawn to the fire in his voice. Daniel stood at the back, watching. He felt a flutter of hope he hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, change was possible. Marcus lowered his voice, speaking directly to the villagers. "Our votes, our voices. They are our true power. Not their money, not their buildings, not their promises. We decide our future, and we will fight for it, together." A murmur spread through the crowd. Eyes widened. Children peeked from behind their mothers. The air was electric. Later that afternoon, Marcus gathered a small group of trusted villagers, including Daniel, in a humble hut. The dim light from a single lantern flickered across the walls, casting long shadows. Maps of the village, farmland, and routes to Golden Heights were spread across a wooden table. "Look," Marcus whispered, pointing at the hills in the distance. "Their trucks take our crops. Their supervisors watch us like prisoners. But if we organize, if we speak together, we can stop them, and we can make our voices heard where it matters most." Daniel leaned over the table, eyes scanning the map. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a mix of anger and anticipation. "This isn't just about money anymore," he said quietly. "It's about dignity. It's about our children." Marcus nodded. "Exactly, and every small step counts. Today we speak, tomorrow we act, and soon they will see that Riverside Hollow cannot be ignored." By late afternoon, the village square was buzzing with energy. Villagers held handmade posters, scraps of paper reading "Our Voice Matters" and "Justice for Riverside Hollow." Women clutched their children. Young men leaned forward, absorbing every word Marcus spoke about unity, voting, and standing together. A few skeptical elders stood to the side, arms crossed, watching cautiously. But as Marcus shared stories of other villages that had resisted oppression, the skepticism melted into curiosity and hope. Even Emma sat on a wooden bench, her small notebook clutched tightly. She scribbled down every word, her eyes wide with wonder. For the first time, she believed her village could rise beyond its suffering. Meanwhile, far away in Golden Heights, Edward Lawson stared out of his glass office at the sprawling city below. Sunset painted the skyline in gold and crimson. A news alert popped up on his phone. Riverside Hollow residents show signs of organized protest. Local meetings reported. Edward frowned. For the first time, he felt a flicker of unease. His office, filled with polished wood, contracts, and a half-empty glass of wine, suddenly felt smaller. "They're just villagers," he muttered. "They can't do anything." But even he could feel it. The first cracks were forming in his world of control. Back in Riverside Hollow, the evening settled over the village like a blanket. Lanterns flickered, fires burned in small pots. The villagers sat together quietly, speaking softly about what they had learned and planning the next steps. Daniel stood beside Marcus under the old baobab tree, staring at the faint glow of Golden Heights in the distance. The contrast between the wealthy city and the struggling village had never been more apparent. Marcus turned to Daniel. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Tomorrow we speak louder, we educate, we organize, and we show them. Riverside Hollow cannot be ignored." Daniel's eyes hardened. "I'm ready," he said, "for my family, for the village, for justice." Above them, stars twinkled silently, as if bearing witness to the awakening of a people long ignored. The village had begun to rise, and the winds of change were already blowing. The sun climbed higher over Riverside Hollow, and today the village felt different. Dust swirled around the bustling square as villagers gathered in small clusters. Whispers floated through the air like sparks. Something was awakening, something long buried beneath years of quiet suffering. Marcus Bennett stood tall atop the wooden crate under the old baobab tree. His agbada fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. His voice rang clear, commanding attention. "Today is not just another day of labor. Today is the first day we speak with our hearts. Today we stand together." The villagers leaned in, hesitant at first, but slowly, eyes brightened, heads nodded. For the first time in years, they felt that change might be possible. Daniel Carter watched from the edge of the crowd, his hands clenched. He had seen too many seasons of empty promises, too many nights of hungry children. But today was different. He could see it in their faces, the mixture of fear, hope, and anticipation. By midday, the villagers began to organize. Under Marcus's guidance, groups formed. Some went to distribute flyers detailing their rights, others went door to door, sharing messages of unity and resistance. Daniel moved among the people, passing out the scraps of paper, explaining the importance of their voices. Children followed him, clutching the small notebooks Marcus had given them to record speeches and ideas. Emma ran alongside, scribbling notes with wide eyes. "This is just the beginning," Daniel whispered to her. Emma looked up, a small smile forming. "One day," she said softly, "everyone will know we existed." By the afternoon, the village square had transformed. The energy was palpable. Women beat drums, their faces glowing with pride. Children clapped and sang. Men swayed to the rhythm, voices loud and full of determination. Marcus moved through the crowd, encouraging them, reminding them that unity was their greatest weapon. Even the skeptics, the elders who had doubted Marcus, began to participate. Their eyes glimmered with cautious hope, smiles breaking through years of worry lines. "This," Marcus said, raising his voice over the rhythm of the drums, "is who we are. Not just workers, not just villagers. We are a people, and together we are stronger than they ever imagined." As the sun began to set, Daniel led a small group to the farmland. There, villagers practiced speeches, shared strategies, and rehearsed their plans to approach the city officials. Sweat dripped down their faces, but excitement and energy overpowered exhaustion. A soft orange glow from the horizon painted the fields, symbolizing hope stretching across the land. Even Samuel Reed, the elderly farmer, lifted his head and smiled faintly, as if for the first time in years he felt pride in his people. Meanwhile, far away in Golden Heights, Edward Lawson's world remained polished and pristine. He sat in his glass office reading reports, but something caught his attention, a small note in the daily news. Riverside Hollow villagers organize protests. A flicker of unease crossed his face. For the first time, the numbers on his spreadsheets and the reports on his desk could not contain the growing threat. "They're just villagers," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Yet even he knew these were no ordinary villagers. Something had changed. Something was awakening. Night fell over Riverside Hollow. Lanterns flickered, small fires glowed in the squares and along the paths. Villagers gathered to share stories of the day, their voices soft but full of resolve. Children whispered excitedly about the speeches they had practiced, the songs they had sung. Marcus and Daniel walked through the crowd, observing. Faces glowed with pride, hope, and determination. Daniel turned to Marcus. "They're ready," he said quietly. Marcus nodded, eyes scanning the village. "Not just ready," he said. "They've awakened, and once people awaken, nothing can stop them." Above the village, stars twinkled like silent witnesses to the birth of a movement. For the first time in decades, Riverside Hollow was alive, not just with survival, but with purpose, courage, and hope. Golden Heights gleamed under the afternoon sun. Towering glass buildings reflected the sky, a kingdom built from money, influence, and ruthless decisions. At the top of one such building, Edward Lawson sat behind his polished mahogany desk. The news replayed a familiar headline on the large screen behind him: "Riverside Hollow villagers begin organized protests." Edward's fingers tapped lightly on the desk. His face, usually calm and unreadable, now betrayed the faintest trace of concern. For the first time, the numbers, the spreadsheets, and the polished contracts felt hollow. He leaned back, staring out at the city that had grown at the expense of places like Riverside Hollow. His office smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the dust and sweat of the village below. Memories flashed in his mind: childhood in a small Nigerian town, the struggle of his own parents to survive, the nights spent dreaming of more. "I didn't want this," he whispered to himself, almost inaudible. "I wanted to build, to provide, not destroy." But ambition had a way of twisting dreams. Deals were made, loopholes exploited, policies supported that benefited his wealth but deepened the suffering of people like Daniel Carter and his village. Edward rose, walking past floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched endlessly before him, glittering, thriving, untouched by the pain below, and yet he felt a weight he hadn't felt in years, a growing unease. Later that evening, Edward visited his private study, a small, dimly lit room tucked away from the world. Here, the mask of the billionaire fell away. He poured himself a drink and stared at an old photograph on his desk. His parents, smiling in modest clothes, a young Edward between them, innocent and hopeful. A knock on the door broke his reverie. His assistant entered. "Sir, there are reports. The villagers are organizing. Marcus Bennett is leading them. They're growing faster than anticipated." Edward nodded slowly. "I know," he said quietly, "and I need to decide. Do I continue with the same path, or—" He trailed off, staring into the city lights. For the first time he felt the conflict between power and conscience. That night, Edward walked through the rooftop garden of his skyscraper. The cold wind hit his face. He imagined the village below, Daniel working tirelessly, children dreaming of something better, women hoping for justice. A single tear threatened to escape, though he quickly wiped it away. Ambition had shaped him, but conscience now whispered, could he change? Could he undo some of the damage his decisions had caused? The dilemma was clear: continue the life of absolute power or confront the consequences of his actions and perhaps make amends. Meanwhile, in Riverside Hollow, villagers slept under the soft glow of lanterns, unaware that their movement had already begun to stir conflict at the very top. Marcus and Daniel had no idea how close their struggle was to awakening the conscience of the man who had caused so much suffering. Above them, Edward Lawson stared at the city lights, a man torn between greed and humanity, his empire secure yet fragile, his soul quietly restless. Tonight, the billionaire's world was calm, but tomorrow decisions would have to be made, decisions that could change everything. Riverside Hollow had awakened. The whispers of hope had turned into marching footsteps, determined voices, and songs of resistance that carried across the dusty roads. Daniel Carter led a small group through the village, distributing handmade flyers about rights, voting, and unity. Every face he passed, men, women, and children, glowed with a mixture of fear, pride, and newfound courage. "This is only the beginning," Daniel whispered, glancing at Marcus Bennett standing nearby overseeing the operation. "We make them see us. We make them hear us." Marcus nodded, eyes scanning the village. "They'll try to intimidate us, to silence us. But they won't break us. Not now. Not ever." Across the distant hills, Edward Lawson sat in his glass-walled office, watching the village movement reports on a large screen. His face was tense, jaw tight, eyes sharp with calculation. "They think they can defy me," Edward muttered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But I built this city, I built this empire, and I will not let a few villagers stand in my way." He made a call. Within hours, city officials and security teams would arrive, bringing bureaucracy, intimidation, and threats to slow the villagers' campaign. Back in the village, the first clashes began, not violent, but sharp in tension. City officials arrived, demanding permits, questioning flyers, and warning villagers to stop. Daniel's hands shook, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. "We have a right to speak," he shouted, standing firm against the intimidating officers. Women and men stepped forward, their faces showing defiance, courage, and determination. Children clutched small signs reading "Justice for Riverside Hollow" and "Our Voice Matters." Marcus raised his hand for calm. "Remember, this is about strategy, not anger," he reminded them. "We fight smart. We fight together." The day passed in a tense rhythm of speeches, planning sessions, and organized marches across the village and farmlands. Daniel led small teams into surrounding areas, explaining their rights to neighboring villagers, teaching them how to engage in local governance and vote wisely. Emma ran beside them, notebook in hand, recording every interaction. She watched as the older women, once silent and hesitant, began to speak confidently to neighbors about their rights. The youngest generation now saw the power of collective action firsthand. As night fell, the village gathered in the square. Lanterns flickered, fires glowed, drums beat steadily. Faces shone with determination, pride, and anticipation. Marcus addressed the crowd. "They will try to stop us tomorrow. They will try to scare us. But we are stronger than fear. Our unity is our power, and together we will make them listen." A cheer rose, echoing across the dusty hills. The movement had grown beyond whispers. It was now a roar. In Golden Heights, Edward Lawson's unease deepened. He watched reports of the village marches, the growing support, and the defiance of his officials. "They are more organized than I thought," he murmured. "Perhaps I underestimated them." The billionaire's empire was vast, but for the first time he faced a force he could not easily control, a united people armed with courage, knowledge, and the fire of justice. Tomorrow, the battle would escalate. Tomorrow, Riverside Hollow would challenge the very foundations of power itself. The air in Riverside Hollow was electric. Word had spread that a public debate would take place in the city square, broadcast for all the surrounding villages to see. The entire community gathered, lanterns, banners, and handmade signs filling the dusty roads. Marcus Bennett and Daniel Carter moved among the villagers, calming nerves and preparing them. Children held small signs reading, "Our voice matters," and "Justice for Riverside Hollow." Across the hills, Golden Heights glittered under the midday sun. Edward Lawson arrived at the debate venue in a sleek black suit, polished shoes reflecting the floor lights, his eyes sharp, calculating. Security personnel flanked him, but behind his confident facade, tension simmered. He was about to face Charles Reynolds, the official candidate representing the villagers' interests. Charles was a tall, calm Nigerian African man in a simple white shirt and trousers, his demeanor serious but approachable. The contrast between Edward's opulence and Charles's humble presentation could not have been starker. As the debate began, cameras captured every angle, the polished skyscrapers in the background, the villagers watching from distant hills, their eyes full of anticipation. The moderator asked the first question about community development and equitable governance. Edward spoke first, voice smooth, confident. "I have built opportunities, investments, and growth that benefit the nation," he said. His expression showed pride, but for the first time a shadow of doubt flickered across his eyes. Charles replied with calm authority, "The people of Riverside Hollow deserve dignity, education, and a voice in decisions that affect their lives. We must prioritize their welfare, not just wealth." The crowd erupted in applause and murmurs. Villagers cheered quietly from the hills. Daniel's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but anticipation. Emma scribbled furiously, her eyes shining with inspiration. Edward's jaw tightened. He had prepared for control, for manipulation, but not for this direct challenge of ideals. Charles's words resonated with the people. They could feel the truth in them. The debate escalated. Questions about corruption, exploitation, and fair governance cut through the tension like lightning. Edward's polished answers sounded increasingly hollow next to Charles's grounded, heartfelt responses. Marcus leaned close to Daniel, whispering, "They're seeing the difference. Look at the villagers' faces. They're believing in us." Daniel nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "This is the moment we've been preparing for." Even Edward couldn't ignore the growing truth. For the first time he felt the weight of his empire's moral cost. His eyes flicked toward the hills, imagining the villagers he had dismissed, their courage shining bright. The final question struck at the heart of the conflict. Will you prioritize the people or your power? Charles answered first, his voice steady and unwavering. "The people always come first. Their dignity and rights cannot be compromised for wealth or ambition." Edward swallowed hard. His confident mask faltered. His eyes reflected inner turmoil. The applause, the cheers, and the chants from the villagers below pierced the polished walls of the venue. By the end of the debate, the villagers' faith in their cause had strengthened. Daniel and Marcus watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the battle was far from over. But the ideals of justice, courage, and unity had taken root. Edward Lawson walked away, silent, his mind a storm of reflection, doubt, and determination. For the first time, the empire he built felt fragile, not because of money, but because of ideals that could not be bought or silenced. The clash of ideals was over, but the election was just beginning. Dawn broke over Riverside Hollow, painting the dusty village roads with golden light. Today was the day, Today, the villagers would exercise the power they had been denied for decades, the power to vote. Children ran through the alleys, banners in hand, their laughter a fragile soundtrack to the seriousness of the day. Women adjusted wrappers, tied headscarves, and whispered encouragements to the men preparing to march to the polling station. Marcus Bennett stood at the entrance of the village square. His face was stern, but his eyes betrayed excitement. He addressed the gathering crowd. "Today we show them our voices cannot be ignored. Today our unity becomes strength. Stand tall, be proud, and remember, you are not just casting a vote, you are reclaiming your dignity." Daniel Carter walked among the villagers, checking on families, calming nerves and offering encouragement. Each handshake, each nod reinforced the silent understanding this day could change everything. At the polling station, tension ran high. Long lines of villagers moved slowly forward. Security personnel sent from the city watched carefully, some suspicious, some tense. Daniel noticed a young boy struggling to reach the ballot box. Without hesitation, he lifted the child so he could place his vote. Faces around them softened in admiration, the power of small acts resonating in the moment. Meanwhile, in Golden Heights, Edward Lawson watched live updates on multiple screens. The precision of numbers, reports, and voter turnout attempted to comfort him, but it couldn't. The sheer determination on display from the villagers made him uneasy. "They're serious," he muttered, voice low, leaning back in his chair. For the first time, wealth, influence, and fear seemed insufficient to control the outcome. Back in the village, Emma scribbled furiously in her notebook, capturing the faces of people as they cast their votes. Old men and women, faces lined with decades of struggle, smiled softly as they deposited ballots. Mothers held children close, whispering pride in their ears. Marcus and Daniel moved strategically, ensuring no disruption occurred, guiding villagers calmly but firmly. Each face reflected courage, hope, and anticipation, the culmination of weeks of effort and resistance. As the sun began to set, the voting lines thinned, and villagers gathered in the square. Lanterns glowed softly, fires flickered, and children played quietly nearby. The sense of achievement, of empowerment, filled the air. Daniel turned to Marcus, eyes glistening. "We did it. They can't take this from us, not today." Marcus nodded, shoulders heavy but proud. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "But today, we reclaim what is ours." In the distant city, Edward Lawson stood by his office window, hands clasped behind his back. The flickering light from the screens reflected in his eyes. He knew the vote could go either way, and for the first time, he felt the fragility of control. His empire was vast, but the people's will be now unstoppable. The night fell over Riverside Hollow. Stars twinkled above, lanterns glowed below, and the villagers rested with a quiet sense of pride and anticipation. Tomorrow the results would decide the path forward, but today they had already triumphed in courage, unity, and voice. The morning sun rose slowly over Riverside Hollow, casting a warm glow across dusty roads, mud huts, and farmland. The village felt different today, lighter, fuller, alive with anticipation. Children ran through the square, clutching banners they had decorated with hope-filled messages. Our voice, our power, and unity brings change. Adults gathered, faces tense, hands clasped and eyes flicking toward the distant city where the election results were being tallied. Marcus Bennett stepped forward on a wooden crate, his agbada catching the first light of dawn. Today, we learn if our courage and unity have made a difference, but remember, whether we win or not, the strength we've found together is ours forever. Daniel Carter walked among the villagers, shaking hands, offering quiet words of encouragement, and glancing at the children learning to carry themselves with dignity. "They've seen us," he whispered to Emma, kneeling to adjust her braids. "They've seen our courage. That matters more than any vote." Emma nodded, eyes wide with awe, recording the scene in her small notebook, feeling the weight of history unfolding. Far away in Golden Heights, Edward Lawson paced in his office. The reports came in slowly, each update heightening his tension. His empire, his carefully built world, had been challenged by the courage of a village. For the first time, he realized that power alone could not silence the voice of the people. When the final results flashed across the screen, the village erupted. A cheer rose like thunder. The villagers had triumphed. Their unity, courage, and hope had overcome decades of neglect and manipulation. Marcus raised his hands, tears glinting in his eyes, and shouted to the crowd, "We did it! This is our victory, not just for today, but for every day we stand together." Daniel embraced the elderly men and women, shaking their hands and sharing smiles that carried decades of unspoken pain, now released in joy. Children laughed, ran, and clapped, their faces glowing with pride. Even Edward Lawson, staring at the glowing screen, felt the weight of the lesson. His face was somber but thoughtful, a mix of pride, regret, and awakening. For the first time, he understood that true leadership required more than wealth. It required empathy, responsibility, and respect for human dignity. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Riverside Hollow. Lanterns and small fires still flickered in the village square, reflecting the warm glow of human resilience. Women, men, and children stood together, eyes shining, voices raised in songs of triumph and hope. Marcus turned to Daniel. "This is only the beginning," he said. Daniel nodded, a quiet smile on his lips. "But today, we prove that courage, unity, and the will of the people can change the world."
Dear viewers, what lesson did you take away from this dramatic tale? We'd love to hear from your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit the subscriber button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest updates. Thanks for watching and stay blessed.